The gate hinge still squeals the same note it did when he was a boy, and he stands there a second before he pushes it, letting his grandson catch up with the dog weaving figure eights around both their legs. "You want to know about the list?" he says. Not really a question. 51 names on it now. You asked me at breakfast why your friend's mother has to wait 2 years for a dozen eggs from this place, and I told you it was a long story, and you said you had time, and I looked at the clock and figured I did too. He leans on the top rail, looking past the chicken houses toward the tree line, and for a moment, he doesn't say anything at all, just lets the wind move through the yard, the way it's moved through it for 100 years. "It starts on a Thursday," he says finally. "March 6th, 1958. I remember the date because it was 6 weeks after I buried my grandfather, and 8 days before the bank in Panora was going to start asking questions about a farm nobody thought an 18-year-old boy had any business running." He says it plain, no drama in it, the way a man describes weather he's long since stopped being afraid of. 40 acres, Millhaven Place, we called it, though there wasn't any mill and hadn't been water enough for one in 60 years. 140 laying hens, barred rocks, Rhode Island Reds, and a farmhouse with a roof my grandfather kept meaning to patch. He died in January. Heart just quit on him out by the corn crib, and I found him there myself, and after that, it was just me. My mother'd passed when I was small. My father worked the rail lines out of Des Moines and never had much use for chickens or dirt, so there wasn't anybody coming to take it off my hands, and there wasn't anybody much interested in helping me keep it either. The grandson shifts his weight, waiting, and the old man notices and almost smiles. Everybody in that county had an opinion about it. Bankers, neighbors, the men down at the feed store, especially the men down at the feed store. There was a fella named Carl Detweiler, ran the only one in town, Detweiler Feed and Grain. 22 years he'd had that business, and I went in there that winter looking to buy scratch feed at whatever discount he'd give a boy who didn't have much cash, and he looked at me like I was something that had wandered in off the road. Called me Elmer's boy like, that was the whole of what I was. Wouldn't even quote me a price. He straightens up off the rail, and something in his face shifts, the way it does when a man's about to tell the part of the story he actually likes telling. Now that same Thursday, he says, that same man was standing in his own warehouse, fixing to burn 41 sacks of corn he swore was ruined. And that's really where this begins. He settles back against the gatepost, and his voice drops into that lower register he uses when he's about to walk you right into a room instead of just telling you about it. Now you have to understand what that store looked like, he says. Detweiler Feed and Grain sat right on Main Street in Panora, brick front, tin sign swinging over the door that hadn't been repainted since before the war. Inside, it smelled like every feed store you ever walked into, dust and molasses and mouse droppings and burlap. And Carl kept it that way on purpose, I think, because it made a man feel like he was standing somewhere that had always been there and always would be. Except that Thursday, the 6th of March, 1958, it wasn't going to be there much longer, and everybody in town knew it. The co-op out on Highway 25 had undercut him on bagged feed 2 years running, and Carl couldn't buy in the volume they could, not anymore. 22 years he'd run that place, and it was going to end not with a fire or a bank auction, but with a man quietly boxing up his own ledgers. He shakes his head slow, like it still bothers him a little, even now. I'd walked past that warehouse maybe 100 times growing up, and never once been let past the front counter. Grandpa always did his own buying, never took me along, I think because he didn't want Carl looking at me and forming an opinion before I'd even had the chance to earn one. Funny how that worked out. Anyway, that Thursday, I had business 3 doors down at the hardware, picking up fence staples, and I heard this racket coming from the loading dock behind Detweiler's, men hollering, sacks thumping down off a wagon bed. I went around to look, the way you do when you're 18 and you've got nothing better waiting on you, and there was Carl standing in the middle of his own warehouse floor with his sleeves rolled up, sweating even though it was cold enough that morning to see your breath, and around him, stacked up like cordwood, were 41 burlap sacks, 100 pounds apiece, corn spilling a little out of a torn one at the bottom of the pile. He pauses there, lets it sit, the way he always does before he tells you the good part. He had a fella from the county loading 2 of those sacks onto a truck bed already, and I heard Carl tell him, plain as anything, just haul it out past the Kettering place and burn it. I'm not paying to cart it any farther than that. Corn. Good corn, or so I thought standing there, and I remember standing at the edge of that dock thinking, a man doesn't burn food unless something's gone bad wrong with it, or unless he's just too tired to think about what else he might do with it. So I asked him, he says, and here, his voice drops the way it does when he's about to hand you a piece of himself he doesn't often take out. I asked him what was wrong with it, and Carl, he didn't even look at me proper, just kept wiping his hands on that shop rag he always had hanging off his belt, and he says, kiln ran hot back in January, cracked the kernels dark on one whole batch. Buyers won't touch corn that looks like that, don't matter what's inside it. It's ruined stock, boy, plain and simple. He shakes his head now, same as he must have shaken it that morning, standing on that dock with the smell of dust and diesel and cold concrete all around him. Ruined, that's the word he used, and I looked past him at those sacks, 41 of them, and I did the arithmetic in my head, the way you learn to do when you've got 140 hens, depending on you, and $11 in a coffee can in the pantry. 4,100 pounds of corn. I didn't know yet what was wrong with it beyond what he'd told me, and I didn't much care, because whatever the trouble was, it wasn't the trouble of a boy who couldn't pay full freight for scratch feed at the co-op. He stops walking now, right there by the gate post, and looks off toward the barn, like he can still see the truck parked crooked in that lot. Now, here's the thing about Carl Detweiler. Nobody tells you when they tell you the whole store's about to go under on him. Man wasn't cruel. He was tired. 22 years running that warehouse, and here comes some co-op 3 towns over selling feed for less than he could buy at wholesale, and he's standing in the wreck of it with corn he can't sell and no reason left to try. A man like that isn't thinking about a boy's hens. He's thinking about what it costs him to keep something around that isn't making him money anymore. So I said to him, plain as I could manage it, standing there trying not to sound like I was asking for charity even though I plainly was, I said, I'll take it off your hands, Mr. Detweiler, save you the burning. He laughs a little here, short and dry, and you should have seen his face. Like he'd forgotten there was a person standing in front of him at all, let alone Elmer Voss's boy, the same one he'd run off the counter back in January, telling him he was too green to be buying feed on credit. He looked at me a long minute, looked at the corn, looked at the fella already loading the truck bed for the burn pile. He shakes his head again, slower this time, and then he said something I didn't understand the weight of for another 2 months yet, not till I was down in that tack room with a cigar box in my lap and my grandfather's handwriting in front of me, telling me exactly what to do with corn like that. He said, boy, corn like that'll kill your flock, quicker than the winter will, said it flat, like he was doing me a favor by scaring me off it. Then he turned around and hollered at the man loading the truck to quit for a minute, and he told me to bring my truck around back. He pauses here, lets the gate creak under his hand where he's been leaning on it the whole while. Now understand. This was the 9th of March, a Thursday, cold enough that the mud in that lot had frozen up hard by 4 in the afternoon, and the sky had that flat gray look to it, like it couldn't decide whether it wanted to snow again or just sit there and sulk. I remember, because I about froze my hands to the tailgate getting that truck backed up to his loading dock. He says the Ford didn't want to start twice that week already, and he'd had to crank it by hand once, cussing at it in a way his grandfather would have boxed his ears for. 41 sacks, 100 pounds apiece. You do the arithmetic on that and it's over 2 tons of corn, and I'm loading it myself, because the man working with Detweiler wasn't about to help a kid he figured was hauling off scrap. Detweiler stood there with his arms crossed the whole time, watching me sweat through my coat in 30-degree weather, and I kept waiting for him to change his mind. Kept waiting for him to say, "That's enough now," after 10 sacks, or 20. He never did, just watched. A quiet settles over him here, and he looks off toward the barn like he's watching that same loading dock instead of his own pasture fence. I'll tell you honest, I didn't feel lucky driving that truck home. I felt like I'd taken something off a man while he was down, and there's a particular kind of shame in that, even when the man himself is handing it to you. The springs on that Ford were groaning the whole 3 miles back to Millhaven, and every bump in that road I was sure I'd hear a sack burst and spill dark cracked corn all over the gravel, and somehow that felt like it had proved something, that it really was ruined, that I really had taken trash off a dying man's hands and called it a gift. He shakes his head slow. Got it stacked in the corn crib by full dark, 41 sacks in a pile taller than me, and I stood there a long while just looking at it, not knowing the first thing what I was going to do with corn. Nobody in the county would touch. My grandfather'd been dead not quite 2 months. I had 140 hens depending on whatever I decided next, and no earthly idea what that was. He looks at his grandson now, like he's making sure the boy's still listening. It wasn't till 3 nights later, looking for a coffee can of nails in the tack room, that I put my hand flat against the wall and felt it give a little where it shouldn't have. Now that tack room hadn't been touched since my grandfather died. I mean it. Not a broom moved, not a nail shifted. It smelled like neatsfoot oil, and old leather, and mouse droppings, and there was a bridle hanging there he'd mended with baling wire that I never did get around to fixing right. I was on my knees digging through a coffee can when my palm come down flat on the board behind the shelf, and it moved. Not much, maybe half an inch. But wood that's been nailed up 30 years doesn't move at all, so half an inch might as well have been a mile. He pauses, and there's a kind of grin creeping up now, like he still can't quite believe it himself, 40 years on. I got my grandfather's flat bar, good German steel, still got it out in the shop, and I worked that board loose. Took me the better part of 20 minutes, because I didn't want to crack it, didn't want to be the fool who broke something to get at nothing. And behind it, set down in a little space no wider than a shoebox, there was a cigar box. King Edward brand, the lid gone soft and swole with damp, and it had my grandfather's initials scratched into the top with the point of a knife, EV, plain as that. He stops there, lets the quiet sit a second, the way a man does when he's telling something he's told 100 times but still feels it new. I didn't open it right off. That's the truth. I sat there on an overturned bucket in that tack room with the lantern throwing shadows on the wall, and I held that box on my knees a good while before I lifted the lid, because I think some part of me already knew, the way you know weather's coming before the sky says so, that whatever was in there was going to matter, and Lord, it did. He looks off toward the corn crib, long since rebuilt, standing different now than it stood then. Inside, wrapped up in a flour sack to keep the damp off, there was a notebook, leather cover, gone dark and soft with handling, the kind of leather that gets that way from being carried in a coat pocket for years and years, not from sitting on a shelf. And when I opened the front cover, the first thing I saw was his handwriting, small and careful, dated clear back to 1928, 30 years of it, near as I could figure, packed edge to edge with writing I didn't understand one word of that night. He glances at his grandson. I'll get to what it said, but you gotta understand what I was looking at first. I was 18 years old, standing in a dead man's tack room, holding the one thing he never told me about while he was alive. I carried it inside that night and set it on the kitchen table under the lamp, and I want you to picture that table, because it hadn't changed since my grandmother died. Same oilcloth, same chip, in the same spot where a coffee cup had sat too hot too many times. I sat there past midnight, reading by that lamp, and the wick needed trimming, and I didn't care. Because the further in I got, the less it read like a diary, and the more it read like a man arguing with himself on paper. Some pages were just numbers, feed weights, egg counts, dates that meant nothing to me yet. But other pages, he'd write out whole paragraphs, and I remember the first one that stopped me cold. It said something like, "Tried mother's way again this week. 3 crocks, corn and buttermilk. Let stand 5 days in the cellar where it stays cool. Hens ate it eager, more eager than the dry scratch. We'll watch the eggs." That was dated April of 1931. In the worst of it, when nobody in this county had 2 nickels to rub together, let alone money for store feed. And there was that word again a few pages later, mother's way, not my way. Not the Hendricks boy's way, or some neighbor's trick he'd picked up at the Grange Hall. His mother's way. My great-grandmother, Hattie, who I knew only from one photograph on the parlor wall, standing stiff in a dark dress in front of a soddy that wasn't even standing anymore by the time I was born. I sat back in that chair and I remember thinking, she's been dead longer than my grandfather was alive when she died, and here she is anyway, in his handwriting, telling me something. I didn't sleep that night, not really. I'd doze off in the chair and wake up with my neck stiff and the lamp burned low, and I'd go back to reading. Somewhere around 2, maybe 3 in the morning, I found the pages that mattered most, where he'd written it out plain, like he was explaining it to somebody who wasn't there yet. Ratios, crock sizes, how long to let it stand, how the smell told you when it was ready and when it had gone wrong. I didn't understand half of what I was looking at, but I understood this much. He'd written it down like a man leaving instructions. I just didn't know yet that they were instructions for me. By the time the sky started going gray outside that kitchen window, I had 41 sacks of corn sitting out in that rebuilt corn crib that Carl Detweiler wanted burned, and I had a dead man's notebook telling me, in his mother's own remembered words, exactly what to do with it. Now here's the part your grandmother always laughed about when I told it, so I'll tell it the way she liked it told. I didn't have crocks. Not real ones, not the kind he meant. 5-gallon stoneware, wide-mouthed, the kind Hattie Voss would have had lined up in a root cellar before the First War. What I had was 2 chipped crocks from my grandmother's kitchen, the ones she'd kept bread dough in, and 3 more I bought off Ruth Kettering's sister-in-law for $1 apiece because she was clearing out a shed and didn't ask why an 18-year-old boy wanted crockery instead of feed. That gave me 41 sacks of corn and 5 crocks. You can do that arithmetic and see the problem I had. So I started small, the way the notebook told me to, whether I meant to or not. 2 parts cracked corn, 1 part water just off the boil, a handful of the old feed mixed in for what he called the starter, though he never explained why that mattered, and I didn't ask the page, because a page doesn't answer. I covered each crock with a scrap of muslin and a stone to hold it down, and I set them in the cellar where it stayed cool and dark, the way his hand had written it, 3 separate times, like he wanted to make sure whoever read it later wouldn't skim past it. Then I did the hardest thing a boy that age can do, which is nothing. 4 days, the notebook said. 4 days of walking past that cellar door a dozen times a morning, telling myself not to lift the muslin because he'd written, plain as anything, that opening it early let in air that didn't belong there and ruined the whole batch. I obeyed a dead man's instructions, the way you obey a fence line you can't see the other side of. I fed the hens the old way that week, out of what corn was left unsoured, and I watched them the way you watch weather. On the 4th morning, a Wednesday I believe it was, I went down those cellar steps before it was even light, and I lifted the muslin off the first crock, and the smell hit me. Sour, sharp, not rotten, not the way Detweiler's ruined feed had smelled behind his warehouse, but something alive, something working. I stood there a long minute with that crock in my hands, not sure if I'd made feed or made a mistake, and there wasn't a soul in the county who could have told me which. So I did what your great-great-grandmother apparently did, according to that notebook, 30 years before I was ever thought of. I fed it to them anyway. Not all of it. That was the other thing Elmer had written, underlined twice, like he wanted to make sure whoever read it next wouldn't get greedy. Quarter measure, mixed with the dry scratch. Morning feed only. Watch 3 days before you go further. So I mixed it thin that first morning, ladled it into the trough alongside the regular feed, and I stood at the coop door with my hands in my coat pockets like a man waiting on a jury. Hens don't lie to you the way people do. A person'll tell you your coffee's fine when it isn't. A hen just won't eat what she doesn't want. Mine went at that trough like I hadn't fed them in a week. I remember laughing out loud, alone, in an empty barnyard, at 6:30 in the morning, which is not a thing an 18-year-old boy once witnessed by anybody. Your grandmother, well, she wasn't your grandmother yet, she was just Ruth Kettering's niece back then, helped at the produce stand. She wasn't in this part of the story yet. That comes later. Don't rush me. What I want you to understand is that for about 2 weeks, nothing happened that you could point to. Same number of eggs, same size, same everything. I started to think I'd wasted good sacks and worse. Wasted the only instructions the man ever left me, on a notion that maybe worked in 1932 and didn't work anymore. I got that sick feeling a man gets when he's put his faith in something and it hasn't paid him back yet, and he doesn't know if it's slow or if it's simply not going to. Then it was, I want to say the second week of April, though I never wrote the date down, which I regret. I was gathering eggs one morning, and I noticed the shells were harder. You crack enough eggs in your life, you get a feel in your fingers, before you ever get a feel in your eyes. And then the yolks. Cracked one into the skillet for my own breakfast, and the color of it stopped me cold. Orange near to red, standing up round in the pan instead of spreading thin the way store eggs did. I didn't tell a soul. I didn't have anyone particular to tell. I just started carrying eggs into town in a different frame of mind than I'd carried them in before, like a man carrying something he'd made instead of something a hen happened to lay, and not entirely sure yet if that was pride or foolishness talking. Your great-great-grandmother's Crocs sat right there in that cellar the whole time, mind you, through my growing up, through Grandpa's whole life practically, and none of us thought to ask what a woman homesteading through drought and then through the worst of the 30s would have needed Crocs that size for in the first place. I think about that some nights, how a thing can sit in the dark not being useless, just being unused, and there's a difference between those two a man doesn't always know to make. Anyhow, I took eggs into Panora that Saturday, must have been the 19th or the 26th of April, 1958, and I stopped in at the produce stand on Main Street the way I always did, more out of habit than hope, because that stand didn't buy much off a boy nobody figured would still be farming come August. The woman running it was named Ruth Kettering, and she'd had that stand going on 11 years by then, ever since her husband passed, and she knew eggs the way your great-grandmother knew fabric. Didn't need to think about it, her hands just told her. She picked one out of my basket without asking, first thing, before I'd even said good morning to her, held it up to the window light, turned it over once. "These aren't Detweiler's feed eggs," she said. Wasn't a question. I told her no, ma'am, they weren't off any feed at all exactly. They were off soured corn out of my own Crocs, and I said it careful, like a man confessing to something, because I still wasn't sure if what I'd done was clever or just strange enough that nobody'd bought a dozen off me expecting an explanation. She cracked one right there on the counter into a little bowl she kept for testing, and I watched her look at that yolk the same way I'd looked at mine in the skillet 3 weeks before. Round, standing tall, color like a harvest moon. "I'll take every one you can bring me," she said, "and I'll take my name down for more before you've even got more to give." That was the first list there ever was. One name, Ruth Kettering, written on the back of a seed packet because that was the paper closest to hand. Dated, she told me later, years on, she still had that scrap somewhere in a drawer. The 3rd of May, 1958. I didn't think a thing of it at the time, beyond being glad of a steady buyer. I surely didn't think I was watching the start of something that'd still be running when you were old enough to ask me about it standing right here at this gate. Ruth kept her word, and word, I've come to learn, is a thing that travels through a small county faster than any truck I ever owned. By the middle of that June, hot already, the kind of heat that came up out of the ground in the mornings before the sun even cleared the tree line, she was selling my eggs out from under her own stand's reputation, telling anybody who'd stand still long enough that Elmer Voss's grandson had found some trick with his hens. She never said what the trick was. I don't know if she knew exactly, or if she just liked the sound of it being a mystery. Either way, I'd come into town on a Saturday with the truck bed loaded with flats, and there'd be women I only half recognized from church, waiting by her stand with their pocketbooks already open. I want to tell you it felt like triumph. Mostly it felt like work. More work than before, if I'm honest. Crocs to check morning and night, a fermentation smell in that barn that took some getting used to, sour and close, like a cellar that's been shut up too long, though the hens never seemed to mind it. I'd stir with a wooden paddle Elmer had notched himself, the same one his notebook mentioned by its number of years in service, and I'd think about him doing this same motion in the dark before I was born, before my mother was born, and I'd wonder what he'd make of a line of Panora women standing in the dust waiting on his birds. By the time the leaves turned that fall, Ruth's one name on the back of a seed packet had become 6 names on a page torn out of my own notebook, a different notebook, a plain one I bought at the hardware for a dime, because I didn't dare write in his. 6 families, none of them kin to each other, none of them knowing yet what they were starting. I kept that list folded in my shirt pocket like it was something official, though there wasn't a soul in the county who'd have called it that. A boy with a list of names and a barn that smelled like vinegar. I didn't know then that Carl Detweiler was watching all this from the far side of a store he was already closing, a man with his own ledgers running the wrong direction. I didn't think of him much that summer at all. I had eggs to gather and a flock to keep even, and a debt to nobody but a notebook and a woman long dead who'd once done the same thing out of nothing but need. By November of that year, Detweiler's sign came down for good. I remember my grandson, that's exactly it. A Tuesday, cold enough the ground had gone hard as a skillet, and they hauled the shelving out on a flatbed truck, like it was furniture from a house nobody wanted to live in anymore. I stood across the street with a sack of layer mash from the new co-op tucked under my arm, feeling something I couldn't rightly name. Not triumph. I want you to understand that plain, because a boy your age might hear this story and think there was some justice in it, some settling of a score. There wasn't. There was just a man who'd built something for 22 years, watching it get carried off in pieces, and a boy who'd built something smaller, watching him do it. He didn't look at me. I don't fault him for that. Word came through the county he'd gone up to his sister's place near Fort Dodge, and then further word. You know how a small county talks. It's a slow leak, never a flood. That he wasn't coming back anytime soon. 2 years, it turned out, though nobody was counting at the time. I wasn't thinking of him at all by the spring of '59. I had a flock that was outgrowing the coop my grandfather built, and a rooster who'd taken to challenging me at the gate most mornings, and Ruth Kettering stopping her old Studebaker on the shoulder of the road just to ask, in that flat way she had, whether I had any extra that week. By 1961, I'd built out the north end of the barn myself, board by board. Some of it lumber I'd pried off a collapsed corn crib 2 farms over for the hauling. 300 hens by then. The list had gone past 20 names, and I'd had to buy a proper ledger book for it, because the hardware notebook had run out of pages, and I wasn't about to write in the leather one. That one stayed in the cigar box, wrapped in a flour sack, same as I'd found it. I read it plenty. I didn't touch it with a pencil. Your great-great-grandmother's handwriting was getting easier for me to read by then. Not the words, I'd had those memorized a while, but the shape of it, the way she pressed harder on certain letters like she was arguing with the page. I used to sit up some nights after the chores were done and just look at it, the way you'd look at a photograph of somebody you never met, but recognized anyway. I didn't know, sitting there with that lamp burning low, that the man who'd once told me cracked corn wasn't worth a boy's time would be standing in my yard again inside 4 years, asking me for something instead of the other way around. 1965. October, and the leaves were down early that year, thick along the fence line so you had to shuffle through them to find the gate latch. He drove up in a truck that wasn't his, borrowed, I found out later, from a cousin over in Adair County, and he sat in it a good long minute before he got out. I was carrying a bucket to the brooder house, and I watched him do it, and I thought, well, there he is. He'd lost weight. The store had been gone 7 years by then, and whatever he'd tried out in Nebraska hadn't taken, and he'd come back to Panora with a little seed cleaning operation and nowhere to put it. He asked if I had barn space to lease. Didn't dress it up, said he'd pay fair rate, whatever I figured was fair, and he stood there with his hat in his hands, like a man who'd practiced saying it plain because the alternative was worse. I gave him the east end of the renovated barn, the part I wasn't using for the layers, and I didn't charge him what I could have. He knew it too. Neither of us said anything about the corn. Years later, maybe 71, 72, he told me himself, sitting right there where you're standing now, that dumping it would have cost him near $11 in hauling and burn permits he didn't have. Said I'd saved him the trouble same as I'd saved myself. That was as close as he ever came to thanking me, and it was enough. The list kept growing after that, slow the way real things grow. Families adding their names, then their children's names when they married and wanted their own carton, then their grandchildren's. 51 now. I checked it Tuesday before you asked me about it at the gate. 51 names, and I can trace better than half of them back 3 generations to somebody who first knocked on this door in 1958, or 61, or 65, asking Ruth Kettering's question before they'd even met Ruth Kettering. The notebook's in the front hall now, in the glass case your grandmother picked out. People ask sometimes if that's really it, the one from the cigar box, and I tell them yes, same flour sack folded up underneath it. I never wrote in it, never will. It's not mine to add to, it's mine to hand on, same as it was handed to me by a dead man's habit of writing things down. So that's your answer. 51 names on a list for eggs, and it started with 41 sacks of corn a man wanted burned. Nobody thought I was worth much that March. Turned out the corn wasn't ruined and neither was I. We'd just both been screened out by somebody who didn't look twice. Go shut the gate behind you. Chores don't wait on stories.